Hey everybody, my name is Josh Peck and I will be speaking with you today about a topic that I think is very important, and this specific area of it actually isn't talked about a whole lot. So I want to talk about Bible prophecy and I want to talk about the rapture, but today's discussion is going to be a little different than most of you are probably used to. Now, for some context on where this teaching is coming from, I recently wrote a book called The Lost Prophecies of Qumran, and in it I talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls and the commonalities that they have with the Bible, especially in terms of Bible prophecy. There's actually a ton of prophecy in the Dead Sea Scrolls that matches up pretty closely with the Bible. And so one thing that I've wondered while going through the Dead Sea Scrolls myself is how might the rapture fit into all of this? Now, just right off the bat, so you guys know where I'm coming from, I am a pre-tribulation rapture believer. However, I do believe that if you are not, the information that you're going to see presented here can still be of use to you. Now, with the proper understanding of the mechanics of the rapture, I think that we can more easily find the best location to place it on the prophetic timeline. We can then compare it with the rest of the pieces that I've talked about in the book, some that I'll go through here. Of course, for an in-depth study into this whole area, it's best to get the book, Lost Prophecies of Qumran. But we can use this video to see how everything might fit together in terms of rapture, Dead Sea Scrolls, and the rest of Bible prophecy. Because one thing that I've wondered for a while, how long of a period of time is there between the rapture and the beginning of the tribulation? Now, there's a common misconception, and usually this is among unbelievers, either unbelievers or Christians who don't study prophecy. But there's a misconception that the rapture is the start of the tribulation, and it's not. The rapture is a signless event, meaning it could happen at any moment. It's imminent. And nothing has to happen before the rapture. Now, there are prophecies that still need to be fulfilled, but they could happen before the rapture, after the rapture. You know, we don't know on some of them. So, for example, a great example of this is the regathering of Israel in 1948. Now, some have wondered how does that fit in with the doctrine of imminency with the rapture. Well, the fact is that you could have had the regathering of Israel after the rapture. The rapture could have come before 1948, and there wouldn't have been any contradiction or any problem in Bible prophecy. So that's what we mean by it's signless. We don't know when the rapture is going to happen. We just believe, I believe, that it's going to happen before the tribulation. But the rapture is not what starts the tribulation. The signing of the covenant with many of the Antichrist, that starts the tribulation. And we don't know how much time there might exist between the rapture and the actual beginning of the tribulation. Now, what I find really interesting is in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you actually find some descriptions of angels performing heavenly temple duties, so temple duties in heaven, at the same time that the priests in Israel were performing their duties in the earthly temple. And the scrolls seem to say that this is why it was so important for the priests to be doing things on the appropriate days. That's why they had their calendar, why the calendar was so important, and they put so much emphasis on that. They believed that there were heavenly rituals in the heavenly temple being performed at the same time. Now, if that seems strange to you, just read through the book of Revelation and compare it with things like Leviticus. I know that seems like an odd comparison, but when you look at some of the temple rituals of the earthly temple in the book of Leviticus and then compare it to some of the things the angels are doing in the heavenly temple in Revelation, then we actually find out, wow, there are angels that are performing tasks in the heavenly temple that seem very similar to what was performed in the earthly temple. Of course, we should expect that. We should expect it because Scripture tells us that the earthly temple is a shadow of the heavenly one. So we should expect that kind of thing. So the scrolls talk about this as well. Angels performing temple duties in heaven at the same time that they're performed on earth. Now this happened, at least during what we call the Age of Torah. That's what the Dead Sea Scrolls calls it, but it's the time of Israel. It's about a 2,000-year period between beginning with the call of Abraham and lasting all the way up to 75 AD. Not exactly 70 AD with the destruction of the temple. There was a temple that was destroyed, obviously in Israel, but there was also another one in Alexandria, I believe that was in 73 AD, and then there was the Council of Yavne, which was the final nail in the coffin of the sacrificial system, and that occurred in 75 AD. So between that 2,000-year period, you had these rituals happening in the temple, and apparently at the same time they were happening in heaven as well. Well, now we're in the age of grace, the church age. According to ancient Jewish understanding, this would be a 2,000-year period as well. Now, we can't put a date on things like the rapture, of course, but it's interesting to see how they kept time, how they understood the length of these ages. Now, this brings up an interesting line of thought. Time itself, either to a certain degree or completely, operates in heaven the same way it does on earth. It would have to if angels are performing the same tasks in the heavenly temple that man is performing in the earthly temple. It means that, at least in part, that time operates the same way in heaven. And this, to me, was really interesting, because if any of you have followed me for any length of time, you know that I'm really into quantum physics, and the whole idea of time is really interesting to me. And for a long time, I've just assumed that time would operate differently in heaven. But that might not be the case. There are those today who say that time in heaven is different than time on earth, and they'll cite verses such as Psalm 90 or 2 Peter 3 as evidence. So Psalm 90 verse 4 says, "For 1,000 years in thy sight are but as yesterday when it is past, and as a watch in the night." We also have 2 Peter 3:8 that says, "But beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing, that one day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is one day." Now, there are also those who maintain that time operates the same as what we experience on earth, and they'll cite verses from Revelation chapters 8 and 22. So Revelation 8:1 says, "And when he had opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about the space of half an hour." And then we also have Revelation 22:8 that says, "In the midst of the street of it, and on either side of the river, was there the tree of life, which bare 12 manner of fruits, and yielded her fruit every month, and the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations." Now keep in mind that Revelation 22, chapter 22, verse 8 now keep in mind, Revelation 22, verse 8, that's talking about the eternal state. This is after the millennial reign of Christ. You would think if there was any period where time would be different, it would be that. But apparently we still have months. So we have two possibilities here. Either time operates different in heaven, or time operates the same in heaven. And I want to explore both possibilities and try to answer whether there's a way to harmonize these two views. And I actually think there is. But before we delve into that topic, we have to remember that it's not the rapture. Once again, I can't emphasize this enough. It's not the rapture that begins the 70th week of Daniel. The confirmation of the covenant with many starts the 7-year countdown until the return of Jesus. Now, if you're a pre-tribulation rapture believer, as I am, then you would argue that the rapture begins sometime prior to the tribulation. If you're mid-tribulation or pre-wrath rapture believer, then you believe the rapture happens sometime around or just after the middle of the tribulation. And then lastly, if you hold the post-tribulation view, then you maintain that the rapture occurs at Jesus' return around the very end of the tribulation. Now, this video here isn't intended to present an argument for one view over another, although since I am pre-tribulation, a pre-tribulation rapture believer, that is the view that I'm most familiar with. That is where I'm going to be explaining my position from. It's going to be from that perspective. But again, I don't want to necessarily make a pre-trib rapture argument here. I just want to use this teaching with the understanding that I believe that it's pre-trib, and you kind of need that belief for the rest of it to make sense. But my hope is that Christians of all rapture beliefs will be able to find this video helpful in some way. So let's start off with a complicated view. Let's figure out if there could be multiple dimensions of time. So in this, we're going to consider the possibility that time runs in heaven, at least in part, differently than it does on earth. Now, I don't believe that time could possibly run totally differently in heaven, because that would render Revelation 8:1 and 22:8 nonsensical. So I suppose someone might make an argument of allegory for those verses, but I'm not an allegorist in my understanding of prophecy and my eschatology and my biblical interpretation. So I would not be the one to support that type of argument. But one might wonder if we're compromising too much by choosing the partly view rather than just saying all or none. Either time is all different or it's not different at all. Are we compromising too much by trying to say, well, maybe it's partly different? It actually turns out it's not that inconsistent as it would seem. Because it does seem inconsistent to say that time can run partly one way and partly another, but as it turns out, it's not inconsistent at all. The good news for this position, the partly position, is that time runs partly differently in all sorts of ways in our own three-dimensional universe. In fact, we see slight variations on our own planet. The single dimension of time that we know of, past to present to future, it's not solid and uniform like we tend to think. So time, a lot like space, can be bent and warped to the point of making it relative. So, for example, time near a black hole is warped to the point that 1 year of Earth time can pass by in a single second. The closer you are to the black hole, the faster time around you moves. But to you, time would feel the same, which is why we say that time is relative. Experiments have even been conducted on Earth showing a clock on a fast-moving jet and a stationary clock on the ground record time differently. The clocks are both recording time correctly, though time itself is moving slightly differently on the jet than time on the ground. So things like gravity and momentum can affect time in the same way that folding a piece of paper can affect its length. As of now, human beings are only aware of one dimension of time. So this means time is like a line made up of multiple points. The past is behind us, the future is in front of us, and the present is constantly progressing from one point to the next, away from the past towards the future. Now, Albert Einstein, with his theory of special relativity, was able to show that time and space are linked in similar and predictable ways. So we can measure time in seconds and minutes, just like we can measure space in inches and feet. Now, with space, we are blessed to be able to perceive more than one dimension. We can experience and measure 3 dimensions of space. But what if there are extra dimensions of time that we can't physically perceive, but that still exist nonetheless? Since time and space are linked so closely together, so much so that even a new word, space-time, was developed in the early 1900s to describe it, we can use known measurements of space to try to understand how something like a second dimension of time might work. So imagine a large rectangular room that we've been commissioned to install tiles in. We know our tiles are squares that are 1 foot long, 1 foot wide. So how many tiles do we need for this floor? Well, to find out, we would need to measure the area, the 2-dimensional surface of the floor of the room. And we do this by measuring 2 perpendicular walls to find the length and the width of the room. Then we just multiply those 2 numbers together to find out how many square feet we need. And, a square foot is a single unit of a square that is 1 foot long and 1 foot wide. So we need to figure out how many of those we need. So, for example, if one of the longer walls in this room is 20 feet, and one of the other shorter walls is 15 feet, then all we have to do is multiply those together to find out that the room is 300 square feet, because 15 times 20 is 300. So in other words, we would need 300 of our tiles, our square foot tiles, to cover the floor. Now, we can measure a hypothetical second dimension of time in the same way. Now, because we're human beings and can only really imagine one dimension of time, we have to rely on math to figure this out. But in doing so, we will have to accept the fact that we cannot envision this in our minds. Now, while I can easily imagine a square foot tile, I cannot precisely imagine a square minute or a square hour. But, simply not being able to imagine it doesn't mean that it does not exist. Just like space, for time to be bent, it stands to reason that there must be a second dimension of time for it to be bend into. It's the same way that if we have a straight one-dimensional line, but we cannot bend that line unless we have access to a second dimension that it can bend into. So time absolutely can be bent. We know that. We've proven that. And this happens pretty frequently throughout the universe. So there very well could exist multiple dimensions of time, and the fact that time can be bent would be evidence towards that fact. Because once again, think of it as like a flat sheet of paper, two-dimensional sheet of paper. Technically there's a width, but let's just disregard that for now. Well, if you want to bend that piece of paper, you have to bend it into a third dimension. If you only have access to two dimensions, you can't really bend it. You can't bend it anywhere. The same would seem to be true for time because it's true for space. So if there's one dimension of time and if time can be bent, it stands to reason there's a second dimension of time where that first dimension can be bent into. So I know that's a little confusing, but that's okay. For our purposes here, let's take 2 Peter 3:8 incredibly literally. Now, I don't necessarily believe that it's meant to be understood this way. It can, but we can use this to help explain how time can be both the same and different in heaven and on earth. Now, that verse says that 1,000 years for us is like a day for God. But it also seems to say the opposite. A day for us is like 1,000 years for God. So for God to literally experience 1,000 years within a single day, there would have to be multiple dimensions of time. We can do some simple math to figure this out. So let's assume that the day here is the one dimension of time that we can perceive. So that's our day, our 24-hour period. For God to experience 1,000 years within the span of that one day, then we need to find out what the width measurement of time, would be. Now, in this example, the 1,000 years would be our total area. That would be like saying there are 20 feet in this 1 foot length. Now, for that to work, the width itself would be the 20 feet, because 1 times 20 is 20. So the width and the square area would be the same, making it really easy to figure out. So if we know that there are 1,000 years in a single day, then the length is 1 day, the area is 365,000 days, or 1,000 years. So we just divide those and we find the width of time would come out to the same number, 365,000 days, or 1,000 years. So if there are only two dimensions of time, the width of time that God experiences would be 1,000 years, which is equal to our 1 day. And that's exactly what 2 Peter 3:8 is telling us if we take that really literally. So it gives us a measurement of that second dimension of time. So while the length is 1 day for us, the width is 1,000 years. We don't experience the width because we don't experience more than one dimension of time, but God does, and probably even more than that. So to him, that 1,000 years fits in that 1 day. Now, if there were 3 dimensions of time, then we would have to know the volume, which is the 3-dimensional occupied area. That's the length and the width. We would need to know those to find the height, or the height measurement in days. Now, hypothetically, if our length is 1 day and our total volume is 365 days, 1,000 years, let's say that verse isn't only talking about 2 dimensions of time. Let's say it's talking about 3, meaning the volume, the occupied space of time in that whole section is 1,000 years, or 365,000 days. Then we don't actually have enough information to find the exact height and width. Those could vary. We could assume that the height is 1 year, 365 days. Then the width would have to be 1,000 days, so roughly 2.74 years, because we would multiply length by width by height to find the volume. So 1 day times 365 days times 1,000 days equals 365,000 days, or 1,000 years. Now, technically, these would be cubed units of time. This wouldn't be the square tiles. These would be like square bricks that are square all around, if you're thinking of the room. And you would need to know how many square bricks to fill the entire room. So these would be cubed units of time, meaning each unit of time would be 1 day long, 1 day wide, and 1 day high. Now, I know that's incredibly complicated, and that's okay. That's okay, because you're gonna thank me in a minute. In a little bit, I'm gonna give you what I think is a much simpler way to understand this.